Egypt plays host to the 58th annual meetings of the African Development Bank and the 49th meetings of the Board of Governors of the African Development Fund in Sharm El Sheikh, Egypt. Discussions offer an opportunity to address Africa's challenges in attracting private sector financing and low-carbon investments and practical policies governments can deploy to address bottlenecks. CNBC Africa in this special broadcast brings you highlights of the 5-day event and more. The 58th annual meetings of the African Development Bank brings us all the way to Sharm El Sheikh in Egypt. Now, the theme for the annual meetings this year is mobilizing private sector financing for climate and green growth. Hello and welcome. I'm David Alabi as I take you through the journey of this year's meetings and highlights as they unfold. Address by the President of the African Development Bank Group, Akumi Adesina, sets the tone for the week-long activities and thematic areas this year's agenda focuses on.
Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 2023 annual meetings of the African Development Bank Group with the theme, Mobilizing Private Sector Financing for Climate and Green Growth in Africa. Sharm El Sheikh brings back some great memories for us. It was right here that the world met for COP27, the place where the world again renewed its commitment to keeping global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. It was right here, under the excellent leadership of President El-Sisi, that the world made the historic decision on loss and damage on climate change. Before us is full of challenges on climate change, no doubt. But it also has and holds massive opportunities on green growth for our economies. To mobilize a lot more private financing for climate change and green growth, governments and development partners should take 5 approaches. First, establish national development plans for green transition for their economies. Second, subsidize green industries to spur growth, raise demand, profitability, and sustainability. Third, multilateral and bilateral financial institutions should provide guarantees at scale to help de-risk investments by the private sector. Fourth, support should be provided for the preparation and development of bankable projects that can provide high risk-adjusted returns to the private sector. And fifth, existing public finance infrastructure should be transferred to the private sector, what we are collectively calling, working with Africa 50, asset recycling, to mobilize more private sector resources for greener infrastructure.
With this year's meeting simultaneously marking the 49th meetings of the Board of Governors, the Chief Host, Chairperson of the Boards of Governors of the AFDB, Hassan Abdallah, and Governor of the Central Bank, as well as the President of Arab Republic of Egypt, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi's opening speeches, lend their voices to the need for more strategic engagement from African leaders and development partners in driving practical solutions.
This annual meetings coincide with the emergence of a number of new challenges on a number of different areas, of which the increased inflationary pressures, geostrategic issues, as well as the spillover of the COVID-19 pandemic. The African continent has not been spared from all of these challenges. We have seen increasing deficits and growing debt distress due to the importance of increasing social protection frameworks. These African governments have had to take on policies which encompass environmental aspects as well as social and economic challenges. And I'm sure that you agree that achieving economic objectives will depend and be contingent on the importance and the strength of institutions.
It is clear that the activities of the AFDB this year is representing an exceptional opportunity to exchange knowledge and expert opinions to face the consequences of climate change and to present a clear agenda according to clear timeline in order to determine the mechanism to face the different challenges that are faced by the African continent in order to reach the achievement of the SDGs.
A retrospective look at the bank group's performance in the past year heralds the annual financial presentation and development impact review, an important feature of the bank's annual meetings covering areas of tremendous success and new scopes of coverage for improvement.
Since the New Deal on energy, we have been able to connect 20 million people with the first-time access to electricity. And that is why countries such as Kenya and Rwanda have increased their access to over 75% and 61% respectively.
Anybody who knows infrastructure project development in Africa and its challenges and what it needs to correct, you know it's really the lack of bankable projects. You know it's also, a long gestation period to develop projects. So the Alliance for Green Infrastructure intends to bring all the parties together, the DFIs, the foundations, the non-state actors, the African Sovereign Investors Forum as a representation of institutional investors to raise $500 million for project development especially, and also project preparation. So project development is going to be with a commercial thinking. And to raise that to catalyze $10 billion of investment faster and with scale.
You're aware of the statistics about 85% of people in Africa are living either in areas of insecurity or very close to areas of insecurity. We have more than 34 million people of displaced persons over the continent, and this figure is on the rise. Insecurity, fragility has no borders. As you're aware, this is a reality we have to contend with. So in the first phase, we have a very clear policy which was approved last year as to how we intervene in areas of insecurity and fragility. We do have a certain number of guiding principles. First, we have to remain engaged, whatever the situation is. Nobody should be left behind.
The president of the AFDB, Akinwumi Adesina, keeps the ball rolling on the next task ahead with a 7-point agenda on the change in global financial architecture and the need for a more responsive, inclusive and accountable system that can support the accelerated development Africa aspires to achieve. Now, it further hinges his note on the role of multilateral development banks.
Today, Africa faces 3 major challenges, and they are continuing. I call them the 3 C's: COVID, climate, and conflicts. The solution to these challenges, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, governors, is the same. So I call the 3 F's: finance, finance, and finance. Global financial architecture needs to decisively tackle climate change. Climate change, as we heard in the first opening session, is devastating the economies of Africa, the continent which accounts for only 3% in terms of Historical carbon emissions suffers disproportionately from the negative effects of climate change. The continent loses $7 to $15 billion annually due to climate change, and the trajectory is that that's probably going to get to $50 billion by 2030. Africa received just about $18.3 billion annually in climate financing between 2016 and 2019. It's paltry. At current trends, the climate financing gap of $242 billion a year will remain through 2030. This will no doubt undermine Africa's efforts to support climate resilience and a just energy transition. We should make COP28, and I'm glad that the COP28 president-elect is here, to be hosted by the United Arab Emirates, a defining moment for mobilizing greater private sector financing for climate change. Excellencies, the structure of Africa's debt has also changed dramatically. While bilateral debt accounts for 27% of debt compared to 52% in 2000, commercial debt now accounts for 43% of total debt, compared to just 20% in 2000. Therefore, the expansion and fragmentation of creditor base complicates debt resolution by the Bretton Woods institutions and also by the Paris Club. There is therefore urgent need to reform the current international financial architecture to make it fit for orderly debt restructuring. Debt resolution in Africa, especially outside of the Paris Club processes, has often been disorderly and protracted with costly economic consequences. To avoid high debt resolution costs and to limit the likelihood of debt crisis re-emerging, the international community needs to push for enhanced transparency on debt and global coordination among creditors. Global contingency financing is not working well for Africa. Think of the following. The special drawing rights issued by the International Monetary Fund has provided, of course, significant resources to help countries to deal with their ever-shrinking fiscal space. But of the $650 billion of SDRs issued, Africa got only $33 billion, and that's roughly about 4.5%. The African Union, as you heard, has called for the reallocation of about $100 billion of SDRs to Africa, with a portion of that going through the African Development Bank. As the chairman of the African Union, President Asali, said, because the African Development Bank is a prescribed holder of SDRs. The African Development Bank has been spearheading the call for SDR rechallenging by developed countries to multilateral development banks. And why? The multilateral development banks can leverage. The key operative word is leverage, the SDRs. The bank can leverage it by a factor of 3 to 4 times. Now, by doing so, it will also allow us to provide greater financing to regional and national development banks all across Africa.
A presidential dialogue elaborates further the context set by the president of the AFDB, with issues ranging from reallocation of special drawing rights to the AFDB, given its leverage and power, and steps to achieve climate resilience on the back of successes from COP27.
As head of state and as chairperson of the African Union, you have a global view of Africa's needs and the huge gap between what the continent requires and the development needs compared to the financial resources available. You made the call earlier in the opening ceremony for the reallocation of the IMF's SDRs, among other initiatives. My question to you, sir, is it a long way to Uhuru, or is Africa making progress?
Last year, we defended that it's better to have these SDRs, but with an institution such as the ADB and the support it is lending to all the countries and its knowledge of the continent, it is well poised to deliver. It's important. We sign papers, and it takes a long time for that to transform into reality. So I've always pleaded, and quite frankly, when we're in Japan, in terms of, in my statement, I pleaded that the pledges that have been made, and then the subsequent pledges that ADB should be the institution through which this SDR should be channeled for reallocation to African countries.
Even the governance structure and the operation framework of the multilateral financial institutions was crafted to handle a different set of challenges of the time then. But even then, even after Africa was integrated into this system, what we see that Africa's voice is very marginal, and even its representation at the management and technical levels is still not in line with our population.
Given the very swift changes that we are seeing currently in the challenges that the globe is facing as a whole, and particularly Africa, we find ourselves in a situation where we need to review this system or this model. Africa should not only be a reserve or a source of resources only, but also a contributor to development and an active agent in growth. This is crucially important in terms of achieving fairness in development. So this is, I think, a challenge that Africa is still facing.
So we need really to keep mobilizing concessional funding. That's one. Second, we need to attract private investment. And as it was mentioned by the President of the Senate, to attract private capital, you need to de-risk some sectors. And the risking sectors, removing those risks, which prevent sometimes those private sector to come in, you need public money. And that public money will come from concessional financing. So it's a chain of things, and we need to fix those issues.
For the past 3 decades, Somalia was not only not allowed to borrow to bankroll development, we were incurring charges from non-payment of existing loans. Under these circumstances, fragile conflict-affected states like Somalia need special facilities to finance economic reforms and recovery, and to be able to respond to the emerging drivers of fragility, such as climate change. And you know, actually, Somalia witnessed it. For the last 5 years, the most severe climate change which caused the most severe droughts. And now we are also suffering floods in different parts of the countries because of the climate change.
Africa is rich in many things, but also very rich in clean energy sources, including wind, solar, hydro, and geothermal. And as such, has a huge potential for low carbon growth and sustainable socio-economic development. But one critical challenge stands in its way, and that is the lack of available, accessible, and affordable finance. And this lack of finance is putting the world's climate goals and Africa's sustainable development at real risk. Addressing this issue is one of the top priorities of the COP28 presidency, and I am very keen to work with all parties to make practical and tangible progress and to ensure that such funds are made available, accessible, and affordable.
Another round of discussions lead to the thematic knowledge events, which is structured into 3 main pillars. The first panel discussion focuses on leveraging innovative financing instruments to crowd in private climate investments in Africa.
Without country ownership, you will always feel that climate action is a burden, whereas we want to make sure that climate action is intertwined with development and that they can echo one another, so that the social impact, the private sector engagement impact, the skilling impact, all of this is seen as an integrated framework rather than contention or exclusion between them. Climate and development should be seen as mutually, they are not mutually exclusive, they come hand in hand. The second is, and this is, we did a study with African Development Bank and many multilateral development banks in the private sector and philanthropists and non-government actors, non-state actors during the run-up to COP, which is the Sharm El Sheikh guidebook for just financing. And there, what is extremely important, each stakeholder has a role to play to make sure that we are able to mobilize climate finance and we are able to engage private sector. All of us know that the gaps for financing, I don't want to go through more statistics, but the gaps for financing are big for the SDGs, are big for climate, and even worse now with the global backdrop, which is very tough and has increased the risk perception and the risk ratings or the risks of investment in countries. So these are all facts. So what we need, and this is also what the study shows, or the excuse, is that the 100 billion or whatever has been pledged doesn't make it to countries because they don't have investable projects.
And in Finland, what we think about of the green transition is really that it's like a key driver of the economy, and there are of course certain risks, and also it needs to be carefully planned. So as an example, I would like to give how we approach these things. So our three ministers, Minister of Finance, Minister of Economy, and Minister of Environment, convened and formed this group of a working group. So it was really inclusive project, 20-something participants, also from the private sector. And they came up with their report, which was published last year. And the issues they identified there, and which I think would be useful for others, is that first of all, this systemic change requires a whole economy approach. And second was that exactly the realization that the private sector is really on a driving seat here. In Finland, it was estimated that 70% of expected investments for this transition would come from private sector.
We do have some funding available within Norway, both for de-risking innovation, but also to support innovators in developing their technology or whatever it is, their project that they want to develop. And so we have something similar in our development corporation, in that we have instruments to try to de-risk. Many people here may be familiar with Norfund, which for a long time has been in the market of de-risking investments in the global south. We've recently also launched a new climate innovation fund, which is managed by Norfund, which specifically de-risks investments in the climate space, which so far has meant renewable energy.
We have to be credible with what we are doing. So we really want to stick to our goals. We created a carbon market, for example, in Germany, to come up with pricing the use of carbon dioxide, and be clear also. That's actually quite a discussion in the population, because if you price something, sometimes prices are going up also for everybody. Yeah? So that's a political discussion you have to face, and you have to see how maybe social injustice has to be balanced in that. So that's something important. And then we are coming up from our own learnings with ideas how we can partner. And that I think is an important thing, is the nexus on water, food, energy. But we also launched last year in the COP here in Sharm El Sheikh a new platform on hydrogen, green hydrogen. So to come up with really reliable partnerships which are financed and which are from the framework set that all partners have some positive effect from that.
We need to have the concerted efforts of the IFIs in order to actually stand up to this challenge of bringing this investments. And we're trying to do our best. Today, our indicators are laughable, in fact, because for the private sector investments, we have around, if you look at the operational part of the portfolio, it'll be $9.5 billion. We have $7 billion, 7.5 of mobilized financing, private sector. I'm talking about only private sector. So, and I'm proud of it, but it's such a tremendous task. It's such a difficult task. And we only did what? 9 cents in the dollar, 90 cents in the dollar? And the task is to do it 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times.
And the second and third thematic knowledge events explore the scope of coverage needed to harness natural capital to finance climate and green growth, as well as key actions to achieve sustainable development in Africa.
First of all, I want to admit that the problem of illicit flows and lack of full utilization of resources exists, and we have to tackle that through tightening of the financial laws and things like that, fights against corruption. But I want to add one element, which I think sometimes is underplayed. It's not enough to have resources and think you'll be rich. Those resources must be transformed into cash for your people to benefit. Otherwise, you'll be sitting on gold, you'll be sitting on copper, deep underground, but your people will not have cash to go to school. If you look at Africa in the last 30, 40 years, take the case of Zambia. We used to produce the same quantity of copper like Chile in the 70s. Now they produce 6 times more copper. How can you be rich? Nigeria used to be known for groundnuts and palm oil. Is it still the leading producer of those items? The answer is no. Coffee, native to Ethiopia, which means started in Ethiopia. Is Ethiopia the largest producer? The answer is no. So therefore, as part of the strategy going forward, we have to ask ourselves, how can we as Africans become more productive, to produce more, to put more on the table? Because only in that way shall we be able to put something aside, shall we be able to finance the needs of your people.
The issue is, which are the priorities? And when I'm talking of priorities, very often we have to balance between dealing in emergency or taking the time, invest, and make so that the next generation will make it happen. But this is a difficult balance because it means at some point that either you deal with today's problems and you don't really invest in the future, or you focus on the future, which means you sacrifice the current generation. And this is difficult. The way we see it in Bank West African Development, we cover 8 countries across West Africa. The way we do it is to try to do both. Let me take a few examples. One of the areas we're focusing is energies. And when we're talking of energies, we're talking of energy mix. We understand transition. We're totally aware that we have to move toward the green energy. We have to move towards sustainable energy. However, we know that fossil energies is still our present today, and we can't ignore that. And I know that sometimes in some debates, some people would push for us to ignore that. What we're saying is that we just can't ignore that. We have to deal with it. And this is the issue. So what we do, we always say, depending on when you are, when you can improve the energy mix, please do it as much as you can at the pace you can do it. It doesn't mean that today every country has to be at the same place, but it means that we need to do things so that we're all converging.
Early warning systems save lives. Example, in Madagascar, when they face tropical cyclone, the fact that we're able to provide them the early warning system 5 days before tropical cyclone, they were likely to move 5,000 people away from harm's way. If that early warning system was not available, probably we'd be losing more life in Madagascar. So the question, how do you scale up that instrument in a way that across Africa, these early warning systems are accessible to government in the way they can make policy decisions and eventually actually save lives. And you can say the same thing about flood in South Africa. You can say the same thing about a drought in the Horn of Africa. So therefore, I will definitely put money to make sure early warning system are actually accessible to Africa. Second, third, contingency planning. Unfortunately, in most of the countries in Africa, when disaster happened in the past, we wait till it happened, it may be too late. So the question is, how do we make sure we can beef up the contingency planning for our member states in Africa in the way we can anticipate and deal with disasters before it occurs? Last but not least, what are the financial instruments available to make sure government, unfortunately I'm sitting here next to Minister of Finance, that always have competing needs to deal with the response to climate change. Number one, we can leverage the insurance market in transferring risk in the insurance market whereby government can mobilize additional resources of budget. So your first response is actually funded to the insurance market. Second, there's so many social safety net, contingency funding, solidarity funding that I believe the African Development Bank and the MDBs can actually mobilize and make sure that when there is a disaster in Africa, no one is left behind.
The launch of the African Economic Outlook for this year highlights the continued resilience of the African economy with a pinpoint on clear knowledge products needed to inform policymakers on the performance of the continent, current global and emerging economic as well as geopolitical issues, as well as risks such as debt, public financial management for sustainable development, climate change and inflation.
The continent achieved an average growth rate of 3.8% in 2022. This year was 4.1% and projected also for 2023, 2024. And that surpasses the global average of 3.4%. But although I want to say that while that is great and we are able to keep our head above water, we all agree that poverty is still very high in Africa. And I think Africa needs to be growing at double digits to be able to have the kind of transformation that we have. But nonetheless, it's very good in very tough times to see that we are quite resilient and able to post these kind of growth rates. So it's clear that African countries are moving in the right direction. I was particularly pleased to see in this report that 5 out of the 6 pre-pandemic top-performing countries are said to be back in the league of the world's 10 fastest growing economies for 2023 and 2024.
I want to point out, for want of time, credit to Eastern Africa region. This region was the only region that escaped recession during the COVID-19 pandemic and has continued an upward trajectory in growth, with an estimated 5.1% GDP growth in 2023. And in 2023, that will continue to go higher, even to 5.8. Southern Africa, on the other side, continues to face strong headwinds because of structural issues, energy shortages, and other factors were already discussed in the macroeconomic outlook report launched in January this year. For all the other regions, the central, the western, the northern, maintain also positive trajectory in growth. So the resilience of Africa's economies cuts across the regions. And in July, we will come to you with the country-focused reports that will try to have deep dives on key actions that each country needs to take depending on their own peculiarities.
I would like to address the issue from a more practical angle. We need the private sector not only for the funding, of course. We've all seen in all countries that the management of the private sector is way more efficient, at least on the long run. That's a fact. And the other side of it is the opportunities. Are there opportunities? Yes. According to the literature, there are trillions of dollars of opportunities. Third issue, is Africa well positioned? Yes. Africa is very well positioned with opportunities, and not only opportunities, with a competitive edge of the resources, of the human capital, and more important, which is just bluntly that top-bottom approach makes it easier to approach. So it boils down to the private sector. How can they, this is a question that we all know the answer to. Yourselves, your good selves, the audience, what motivates them is only one thing. This is not CSR business. No matter how long we talk to them, the angle, and even this is a wrong angle, that we should make sure that the return on equity given to these private sector warrants this risk, and even more than warrants this risk by a premium for the innovation and because it's something new. Now, how can this be? The MDBs play a crucial role in this. They have already, and thanks to all of them, they've already increased the awareness a lot.
What triggered my interest most was the combination of what is needed is innovation, scale, and the right risk mitigants. And as a banker, I thought these are exactly the sort of three words I like. And what I heard also now from, of course, the governor of the Egyptian central bank is what we need to do is get this mix of innovation, risk return, and scalability right to really attract the private sector at scale. And yes, I've been only in North Africa active as for the EBRD, but we are looking south. But if I give an example from Egypt, if you look at Benban, at the time it was Africa's largest solar park, it really brought exactly these elements together. Innovation, the right risk return for the private and the public investor, and scalability for a large solar farm.
One of the things I was thinking about when he was speaking was the fact that the Africa Bank is showing the way, particularly on how we tackle the need for far more money. The challenge is to turn billions into trillions, and I see Mia Motley's Bridgetown agenda at the heart of how you do that. And what I'm particularly impressed by with the Africa Bank is the way that the Africa Bank is inventing and discovering and working up a whole series of different ways of increasing that funding. So Britain is helping. We have provided these guarantees, which mean that the bank can lend far more. And when I was at the World Bank too, I felt that, we've got within the multilateral system, within the multilateral banks, an extraordinary array of talent. And we need to harness that to achieve the tasks that Mia Motley and others have set us. So to me, it is the leadership that the Africa Bank is showing, not just in terms of the work that's being done in Africa, which the President and others have ventilated so well today, but it's also in the inventiveness, the financial engineering that is coming out of the bank as we tackle these problems together.
Now, when this presentation was very rich in information, the interest was to see the contrast between the strengths and the weaknesses, strengths that are obvious for Africa. This was clearly explained throughout the presentation. Resources, tremendous demographics, the will, a bank, as we have all convened right here to support this bank to make the best use of the resources. This is a strong ship, but that sails against the wind. This is what I keep. There is soundness. We have charted a clear course. However, we are facing these strong headwinds that are generated by a situation that is provoked outside Africa with geopolitical events that bear issues with this imported inflation that causes tremendous damage, but also, of course, a challenge that is closely related to what is taking place right here in Africa. That is why the bank, as this were clearly stated in many contributions, a bank that has provided a lot of theory in terms of assistance and help to Africa, whereby Africa can play a role, because anything that will cement Africa from within using its own devices will help to steadfastly resist to this uneasy context.
In a nutshell, I think clearly the development region of Africa has many financing gaps. We heard from AFDB on the climate financing gaps. We often hear about infrastructure financing gaps. For those that haven't heard the numbers in the trade finance space, it's over $100 billion per annum. And I know that's one of the things that the EBRD can do quite easily, among other things, of course, such as longer-term financing. And here I think there's a huge opportunity for you to come in and very quickly step into that segment of the financing landscape and provide much needed support to banks and financial institutions who really need credit enhancement in order to issue letters of credit and trade with the rest of the world.
Commendations come in for state participants and donors of the African Development Fund for the historic $8.9 billion ADF-16 replenishment, including the $8.5 billion in core ADF funding and the $429 million for the newly created Climate Action Window.
At the African Development Bank today, we put 67% of all of our investment in climate adaptation, which is the largest and highest among any multilateral development banks that you would see. We have launched also what is called the African Adaptation Acceleration Program, which is to mobilize an addition of $25 billion for climate adaptation in Africa, together with the Global Center on Adaptation with my dear friend and our chairman of the Global Center, which is Ban Ki-moon, the former UN Secretary General. And so we are doing a lot to be able to mobilize more resources. But the fact of the matter is, it's not going to be enough. The private sector has to play a big role 100%. In this particular issue.
We're very grateful that the deputies of the African Development Fund actually agreed that we could set up that window, and we got initial funding from several countries. So what we're doing now, and if you recall, that climate action window is targeted to low-income countries because I think they struggle the most to mobilize international climate finance, and especially for adaptation, because I think the focus of international finance has been around mitigation. So we've set up that window, and in fact, we've had 2 initial operations. You were there when we talked about those 2 operations in Egypt and Senegal. On the room to run, but on the climate action window, we already have a couple of operations that are in place. And the idea is that we will supplement operations that we do in those countries to include climate adaptation in things like infrastructure projects, for instance. But in addition to that, we want to help a lot of the low-income countries work on their NDCs, work on their long-term strategies, because again, for money to flow to any particular area, there needs to be policy clarity. They need to know, the private sector needs to know what the rules are.
And talking about cementing commitments and deals now, this year's annual meetings offer a range of investment opportunities from hydropower to plastic recycling, green projects, with African Investment Forum showcasing projects worth about $1.5 billion in green and renewable energy deals. And away from that as well, a roundtable on Zimbabwe's debt clearance evokes a call from President Akumi Adesina to development partners to walk with Zimbabwe, the only African country currently under economic sanctions by its creditors.
We have been very clear with His Excellency the President Because we went, President Chissano and I, to the United States, to State Department, to Treasury Department, to USAID. We met with Congress and so on. Why? Because of ZIDERA, the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act, which is an act of Congress that's actually lead to many of the sanctions. So, but the key there is good, free, and fair elections, to have good democratic space, freedom of speech, freedom of association, and of course, good governance over land reforms. Those are the ZIDERA conditions, and the president is committed, the ministers are committed to making sure that we can make progress on ZIDERA, and hopefully it can then lead to the discussion on how to lift the sanctions. The last thing I want to say is just to explain the issue of compensation of the farmers. So we can't make the same mistake twice. And that's why we have said that it's important that the commercial farmers be compensated. And I want to thank His Excellency the President for making that decision, and also the Minister of Finance for implementing that decision, the Minister of Justice for making sure these things could be done. And the Minister of Finance has committed to $3.5 billion. Well, here's the problem. They can't pay $3.5 billion. They've only been able to do what, $1 million? How much? $1 million. Yes, but they need more resources. But they're under sanctions, so how are they going to get the resources from? And that's why we suggested to them that we need to look for new ways of front-loading the financing structure that will allow them to front-load the payments of the commercial farmers. And we are discussing that with them. The president, I discussed with the president agreed, the Minister of Finance agreed, and we are working with them.
In December 2022, we established a structured dialogue platform. The dialogue process is designed to institutionalize constructive engagement with all our creditors and development partners. The agreed pillars for this process and implementation are as follows: economic reforms, governance and reforms, land tenure reforms, compensation of former farm owners, and the resolution of bilateral investment protection and promotion agreements, BIPAs. These reforms are discussed in technical meetings, which incorporate representatives from government, international creditors, development partners, represented by their ambassadors, the private sector, and the civil society organizations.
By no mere coincidence, delegates attending this year's annual meetings go all out to celebrate Africa Day with hopes for better prospects for the continent and its youth. Now, the commemoration also marks the 60th anniversary of the establishment of the African Union.
Africa is a land of opportunities. In the infrastructure space, we see a lot of opportunities. We will see people that are willing to roll up their sleeves. They will make huge impact and also make good money. And we call on all Africans and non-Africans to come in and look for themselves, and they will be very, very pleased with what they see.
It's a great opportunity as we celebrate 60 years of Africa. Said we've come very far and we are moving in a very good direction. And one of the key issues that we're working on right now is a study. It's ourselves, the African Development Bank, and AUDA NEPAD on inclusive growth and sustainable development. That study aims to position Africa grow at rates of 7 to 10% up to the year 2063, when we'll be marking 100 years of the OAU.
Yeah, but how far along is that study now?
This study is going to be unveiled in December this year.
This is the only continent we've got, the continent of Africa, tremendously blessed, a continent with absolutely amazing potential. But this message is in particular for the youth of Africa. I just want to say, stay the course, remain in hope. The future is bright. The best is yet to come. The future ahead of us is a good one.
With Egypt solidifying its position as a global historic center for culture and tourism, the governor of South Sinai, Major General Khalid Fouda, says the country's arms are ever open to welcome tourists and investors alike.
يعني هي عملية تسويقية طبعا احنا قايمين بيها بنقوم بيها عملية تسويقية بنقوم بيها انا بطلع في جولات في الخارج وانا ما عنديش مشاكل ابدا ان اطلع جولة للدول الافريقية.
I travel a lot across the world, making connections with global leaders to deepen relations between Sharm El Sheikh and the rest of the world. Now I'm calling on all African leaders, extending my request for partnerships to explore mutually beneficial areas of engagements. I'm also calling on investors to come to Sharm El Sheikh. We have great infrastructure and business environment that secures your investment.
احنا نعمل توأمة سيستر سيتيز مع شرم الشيخ دي هيساعد على نقل التجارب والخبرات والتعاون وحركة السياح بين المدن. فأنا ما عنديش مشكلة أبدا إن أنا أعمل اتصالات وأعمل لقاءات في الدول الأفريقية.
As activities for this year's annual event winds to a close, it climaxes with the handing over of the chairmanship of the boards of governors from Dr. Hassan Abdullah of the Arab Republic of Egypt to Kenya's Finance Minister, Professor Njuguna Ndugu, as Kenya gets set to host next year's annual meetings.
I firmly believe that the closing of this year's annual meetings is not an end, but a new starting point. Let's build on what has been achieved and look ahead into the future. Now, it's a call for action. On behalf of Egypt, we would like to extend our congratulations to Kenya for being selected as the host country for the 2024 African Development Bank annual meetings scheduled to take place in Nairobi from 27th to 31st of May 2024. We are confident that Kenya, with its strategic location, vibrant economy, and dynamic society, will provide an outstanding setting for the 2024 annual meetings.
I also humbly accept the role of the chairperson of the boards of governors of the African Development Bank and the African Development Fund, and it allows me actually to extend my appreciation to Honorable Hassan Abdallah, Governor of Egypt, for his efforts as chairperson of the boards of governors for the last 1 year. He has indeed diligently and devotedly guided the business of our bank, and I'm delighted to have a strong foundation to build on coming from him as I succeed him in this noble responsibility. On behalf of His Excellency the President of the Republic of Kenya, Dr. William Samoei Ruto, the government of Kenya is honored and delighted to host the 2024 African Development Bank annual meetings. And indeed, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, you will be coming to Kenya, and Kenya will show is very committed to this task. And we are also very committed to ensure economic excellence and sustainability despite the global shocks.
No doubt it has been an epic week of talks and action points. Parting words from the president of the bank group draws the curtain on the 2023 annual meetings with a clear message, a call for sustained commitment in the implementation agenda of climate and green growth for the continent and a leverage on the support of the private sector.
Let us leave Sharm El Sheikh with a greater sense of commitments, a greater commitment to working together, a greater commitment to supporting your bank, a greater commitment to supporting Africa, a greater commitment to building a more resilient and prosperous Africa, a greater commitment to stay with Africa. For Africa will shine.
In the words of the president of the African Development Bank, Akumi Adesina, Africa has the capacity to solve its own problems and meet its developmental agenda. On that note, it's a wrap on the highlight from the 58th annual meetings of the African Development Bank here in Sharm El Sheikh, Egypt. Many thanks for watching. I'm David Alabi.